January 29, 1863. Dawn bright and cold, encased in snow and silence. The Shoshone Indian camp located near the banks of Bear River, near present-day Franklin, Idaho, had little idea what that fateful day held in store for them. In the early dawn hours, screams, gun smoke, and the feverish sounds of a pitched battle pierced the air. Within a few minutes, California militiamen had burned the Shoshones' homes, shot their husbands and sons, raped and killed women, and blood-stained the white snow, bringing immense sorrow and grief to the Shoshones. This catastrophe happened in the Cache Valley, originally called Sihubugoy, Shoshone for Willow Valley. It was the traditional hunting ground for the northwestern Shoshone tribe. There they gathered grain and grass seeds, hunted small game such as ground squirrel and woodchuck, and also large game including bison, deer and elk. For this reason, the mountain valley had attracted fur trappers and other immigrants, and that's where all the problems began. The Indians migrated back and forth through this region with the seasons, taking advantage of the best weather and making use of plants and wildlife in their daily lives. When the fur trade was brisk, trappers of European extraction entered the area, seeking beaver and other furs. They learned much from the Native Americans about survival in the area's sometimes harsh conditions, and they gathered annually at rendezvous to sell their furs, buy new supplies, share news and meet old friends. Over the 2 decades of active fur trade, 16 rendezvous were held, 4 in what is now the Bear River Heritage Area, and the other 12 within 65 to 200 miles. Cache Valley, which straddles the Utah-Idaho border and is home to Logan, Utah and Preston, was named Cache Valley for the mountain man practice of caching their pelts there. By 1856, European Americans had established their first permanent settlements and farms in Cache Valley, starting at Wellsville, Utah, and gradually moving northward. Brigham Young, the second president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, made the policy that Mormon settlers should establish friendly relations with the surrounding American Indian tribes. He encouraged their helping to, quote by quote, feed them rather than fight them. Despite the policy, the settlers were consuming significant food resources and taking over areas that pushed the Shoshone increasingly into areas of marginal food production. The local Shoshone Indians complained that the Mormons used so much of the Cache Valley that the once abundant game no longer appeared. The foraging and hunting by settlers traveling on the western migration trails also took additional resources away from the Shoshone. As a result, the natives became impoverished. Desperate and starving, the Shoshone attacked farms and cattle ranches for food, not just for revenge, but also survival. Another attack happened in 1859 when a settler company of about 19 people from Michigan was traveling on the Oregon Trail near Fort Hall. They were attacked at night by people they assumed were local Shoshone. Several members of the company were killed by gunfire. The survivors took refuge along the Portneuf River where they hid among the bulrushes and willow trees. 3 days later, Lieutenant Livingston of Fort Walla Walla, leading a company of dragoons, met the survivors. He investigated the incident and documented what he called the brutality of the attack. The detachment of Lieutenant Livingston's dragoons found 5 bodies at the scene of the massacre that were mangled. A girl of only 5 years old had her ears cut off, her eyes gouged out, both legs amputated at the knees, and by all appearances was made to walk on her stumps. On September 9, 1860, Elijah Utter was leading migrants on the Oregon Trail when they suddenly were attacked by a group of presumably Bannock and Boise Shoshone. Despite the settlers' attempts to appease the Native Americans, the Indians killed nearly the entire migrant party and drove off their livestock. Alexis Van Ornum, his family and about 10 others hid in some nearby brush only to be discovered and killed. Their bodies were discovered by a company of US soldiers led by Captain Frederick Dent. Lieutenant Marcus Reno came across the mutilated bodies of 6 of the Van Ornums. The survivors reported that the attacking warriors took 4 of the migrant children captive. As a direct result of this attack, the army established a military fort near the present location of Boise, Idaho, along the Migrant Trail. Colonel George Wright requested $150,000 to establish a military post to sustain 5 troop companies. Zacchaeus Van Ornum, Alex's brother, heard from a relative on the Oregon Trail that a small white boy was being held by a group of northwestern Shoshone likely to be in Cache Valley. Van Ornum gathered a small group of friends and traveled to Salt Lake City to get help from the territorial government. There he visited Colonel Connor at Fort Douglas and asked for help to regain what he thought was his nephew. Colonel Connor agreed and sent a detachment of cavalry under the command of Major Edward McGarry to Cache Valley near the town of Providence, Utah. Van Ornum located a small group of Shoshone warriors being led by Chief Bear Hunter. He and McGarry's men followed the Shoshone as they retreated to the nearby Providence Canyon. After the Indians opened fire, McGarry gave the order to commence firing and kill every Indian they could see. A skirmish between the Shoshone and the US Army lasted about 2 hours after the Shoshone established a defensible position in the canyon. Finally, Chief Bear Hunter signaled surrender by climbing a foothill and waving a flag of truce. Together with about 20 of his people, Chief Bear Hunter was taken prisoner and transported to the soldiers' camp near Providence. When asked about the young white boy, Bear Hunter said the boy had been sent away a few days earlier. McGarry instructed Bear Hunter to send his people to bring back the white boy. He then held Bear Hunter and 4 warriors hostage. By noon the next day, the Shoshone returned with a small boy that fitted the description of Reuben Van Ornum. Zacchaeus Van Ornum claimed the boy was his nephew and took custody, departing to return to Oregon. On December 4, 1862, Connor sent McGarry on another expedition to Cache Valley to recover some stolen livestock from the Shoshone. The Shoshone broke camp, fled in advance of the army troops, and cut the ropes of a ferry at the crossing. McGarry got his men across the river but had to leave their horses behind. Eventually, 4 Shoshone warriors were captured and held for ransom. McGarry ordered that these men would be shot if the stock was not delivered by noon the next day. When the Shoshone chiefs moved their people further north into Cache Valley, a firing squad executed the captives and dumped their bodies into the Bear River. The final catalyst for Connor's expedition was a Shoshone attack on a group of 8 miners on the Montana Trail. They came within 2 miles of the central Shoshone winter encampment north of Franklin. The miners missed a turn and ended up mired and lost on the western side of the Bear River, unable to cross the deep river. 3 men swam across the Richmond where they tried to get provisions and a guide from the settlers. Before they returned, the other 5 men were attacked by Shoshone. When the Richmond people returned with the advance party, they recovered the bodies of the miners and buried them at the Richmond City Cemetery. Due to such reports, Connor was ready to mount an expedition against the Shoshone. He reported to the US War Department before the engagement.
I have the honor to report that from information received from various sources of the encampment of a large body of Indians on Bear River in Utah Territory, 140 miles north of this point, who had settlements in this valley to the Beaverhead Mines, east of the Rocky Mountains, and being satisfied that they were a part of the same band who had been murdering immigrants on the overland mail route for the last 15 years, and the principal actors and the leaders in the horrid massacres of the past summer, I determined, although the season was unfavorable to an expedition in consequence of the cold weather and deep snow, to chastise them if possible.
Colonel Connor began moving at about 1 a.m. the next morning for a surprise attack, but an attempt to get a local settler to act as a scout for the immediate area led the actual advance to wait until 3 a.m. This military action occurred during perhaps the coldest time of the year in Cache Valley. Local settlers commented that it was unseasonably cold even for northern Utah, and it may have been as cold as -20 Fahrenheit on the morning of the 29th when the attack began. Several soldiers had come down with frostbite and other cold weather problems, so the 3rd Volunteers were at only about 2/3 of their strength compared to when they had left Fort Douglas. The Shoshone chiefs were far from ignorant of the potential for conflict with Colonel Connor's soldiers, and some minor preparations were made simultaneously. Most of this involved mainly gathering foodstuffs from surrounding Mormon settlements, in a fashion similar to the incident with the residents of Richmond, Utah. Most of the firearms that the Shoshone had at the time of the attack had been captured in minor skirmishes, traded from fur trappers, white settlers, and other Native American tribal groups, or simply antiques that had been handed down from one generation to another over the years. Their weapons were not as standardized or as well built as the guns issued by the Union Army to the soldiers of the California Volunteers. Major McGarry and the 1st Cavalry units of the 2nd Regiment California Volunteer Cavalry arrived at the massacre scene at 6 a.m., just as dawn broke over the mountains. Due to the weather conditions and deep snow, it took time for Connor to organize his soldiers into a battle line. The artillery never arrived as they got caught in a snowdrift 6 miles from the Shoshone encampment. Chief Sogwich noted the approach of the American soldiers, saying just before the first shots were fired,
"Look like there is something up on the ridge up there. Look like a cloud. Maybe it's a steam come from a horse. Maybe that's them soldiers they were talking about."
Initially, Connor tried a direct frontal offensive against the Shoshone positions, but was soon overwhelmed with gunfire from the Shoshone. The California Volunteers suffered most of their direct combat-related casualties during this first assault. After temporarily retreating and regrouping, Connor sent McGarry and several other smaller groups into flanking maneuvers to attack the village from the sides and behind. He directed a line of infantry to block any attempt by the Shoshone to flee from the attack. After about 2 hours, the Shoshone had run out of ammunition. According to some later reports, some Shoshone were seen trying to cast lead ammunition during the middle of the battle and died with the mullets in their hands. Bear Hunter was killed and was among those casting bullets. If you are faithful, you shall assemble yourselves together to rejoice upon the land of Missouri, which is the land of your inheritance, which is now the land of your enemies. These words were spoken by Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism and the Latter-day Saint movement. The charismatic young man was only 24 years old when he formed his new church in upstate New York, and where he attracted tens of thousands of followers. Smith stated that he had received a revelation that the second coming of Christ was near, that the city of Zion would be established in the vicinity of the town of Independence in Jackson County, Missouri, and that his followers were destined to inherit the land held by the current settlers. In 1831, Smith's followers began to settle in Jackson County, or what the Mormons called New Jerusalem. Jackson County, which is located in the western portion of the US state of Missouri, was already inhabited by early European settlers, whom had come west precisely to avoid any community or religious interference in their lives. This fundamental divide would eventually contribute to hostilities against the Mormons. A missionary from the American Home Missionary Society who had been sent to Jackson County before the arrival of the Mormons described Jackson County as, quote-unquote, a godless place filled with so many profane swearers. The majority of the people make a mild profession of Christian religion, but it is mere words, not manifested in Christian living. He wrote of saloons and prostitutes, horse racing, gouging, and other forms of violence. Christian Sabbath observance here appears to be unknown. It is a day for merchandising, jollity and drinking, gambling and general anti-Christian conduct. The anger that erupted early in Jackson County over the Mormon religion and preaching was not unusual. Nearly everywhere in America where Mormon missionaries had preached had witnessed similar tensions. The crucial difference in Jackson County was Joseph Smith's declaration in July 1831 that the county was the location of a Latter-day Saint and the future site of New Jerusalem. This assertion ended up being a nagging thorn that first irritated and then inflamed the early white settlers. Not only the irreligious, but also the religious residents of other Christian denominations saw the Mormon settlers as a danger to their way of life. Alexander Majors, a teenage Jackson County resident at the time, reported, "They claimed that God had given them that locality, and whoever joined the Mormons and helped prepare for the next coming of the Lord Jesus Christ would be accepted on all rights. But if they didn't go into the fold of the Latter-day Saints, that it was only a matter of time when they would be crushed out." He added that Mormons believed Jackson County was their promised land and that they had come to possess it. He also said that Mormon leaders asserted that the Lord had sent them there and would protect them against any odds in the way of numbers. If you like history-related content like this video, consider subscribing. I post on a regular basis about mainly American history but also other major events. So if you want more of this amazing stuff, hit the subscribe button on the lower left side of the screen. Also, don't forget to leave a comment of your subscription. Thank you. Now let's continue the story. Suspicion increased among the early settlers of Jackson County when the Mormons declared the prophetic destiny of the Native Americans. This was in absolute contrast to most Americans who feared and often despised Indians. The Mormons held the belief that the indigenous peoples of the Americas are descendants of the ancient Israelites who migrated to the New World. They are referred to as Lamanites, and the narrative of the Book of Mormon chronicles their history and struggles. This belief in a shared lineage means that Mormons have traditionally viewed Native Americans as their spiritual kin. From a Mormon perspective, the indigenous populations hold a special place in God's plan. They are seen as a chosen people who would eventually come to embrace the teachings of the Latter-day Saint Church and play a significant role in the latter days. This Mormon belief about the Native Americans was an indication for the early settlers that the Mormons were colluding with the natives in the region. Another reason for the mutual antagonism against the Mormons was that many of the New England, New York, and Ohio Mormons were anti-slavery. This idea posed a threat to some of the early settlers that owned slaves, believing that Mormon presence in Jackson County would eventually lead to the abolishment of slavery. Some Missourians believed that the Saints were interfering with the settler slaves and were working for their freedom. Obviously, the Mormons posed a political threat to the original residents. By early summer 1833, over 1,000 Latter-day Saints had arrived in the county, representing more than a third as many as the combined other citizens. Mormons had been streaming in by the dozens each week, and it was boasted that thousands more were coming. By 1834, the early settlers feared that the Mormons could have wrested political control from those who had established Jackson County in independence, and that prominent Mormon figures could take power once the Mormons had sufficient voters. Harmony never existed between the Mormons and Gentiles in Jackson County. Violent episodes occurred often before the summer of 1833. Amazingly, outright fighting had not broken out already. On July 1, 1833, Reverend Pixley, the Mormons' religious arch-enemy, started distributing a pamphlet entitled "Beware of False Prophets." He carried this from house to house to incense the citizens against the Mormons and to drive them from the county. William W. Phelps, one of the leaders of the Latter-day Saint movements, hastily wrote an answer to Pixley's little pamphlet and printed it on the first page of his paper. It bore the same title as Pixley's "Beware of False Prophets." The Phelps Press printed the July issue and got it out about the 10th of the month. The article had a plain message: "There cannot be but one Church of Christ, as there is one Lord, one faith, and one baptism." Phelps claimed that many ministers from the diverse denominations came forward supported by large salaries and striving shrewdly to maintain the systems invented by man, since they rejected the gift of the Holy Spirit. He said that these men came in sheep's clothing but were full of pride and full of contention, fond of vanity. Phelps suggested that the proper means of ascertaining a true prophet was to compare his prophecies with the ancient word of God and see if they agree, because the scriptures declare, "The Holy Ghost dwelt not in unholy temples, by their fruit shall they be known." Clearly, Phelps didn't calm any waters, but rather further incensed the saints' opponents. By early July, the powder cake was about to be lit. A crucial event took place at a Sunday Mormon preaching meeting at the Temple Lot. Church leaders invited William McClellan, one of the Missouri Saints who was a noted orator, to deliver the sermon. McClellan reported that a large number of local citizens turned out to hear him preach. He chose as his text for his 2-hour sermon the gathering of the last days. McClellan, like Phelps, was a known firebrand and had the reputation of whipping up the emotions of his listeners. He prophesied that within 5 years, all unbelievers in Jackson County would be destroyed. That very day, some of the principal men of Jackson County met together and formulated a document, pledging to each other their property, their lives, and their sacred honors to drive all the Mormons from the county, peaceably if they could, but forcibly if they must. The now militant Jackson County leaders met secretly on the 4th of July and decided to draft a manifesto of beliefs. Over the next several days, a committee of leading Mill citizens composed a document that came to be known as the Secret Constitution. The authors went door to door seeking signatures, and hundreds of citizens signed the document. The document began, quote unquote, "We, the undersigned citizens of Jackson County, believing that an important crisis is at hand as regards our civil society in consequence of a pretended religious sect of people that have settled and are still settling in our county. They call themselves Mormons." The petitioners declared that they intended to rid their society of this Mormon menace, as by the law of self-preservation. They called for a meeting to take place at the courthouse on Saturday, July 20. Signers included such leading citizens as the county clerk, assistant county clerk, jailer, Indian agent, postmaster, militia colonel, 2 justices of the peace, constable, and 2 well-to-do merchants. During this difficult time, Mormon families and independents sometimes gathered together at the home of Bishop Edward Partridge for their protection. The bishop's daughter Emily later wrote in her memoir that church members had no idea what the mob might do. Thus, the brethren armed themselves and held regular prayer meetings. Emily also said, quote unquote, "Children had heard so much about the mob that the word was a perfect terror to them. They would often cry out in their sleep and scream, 'The mob is coming! The mob is coming!'" Missouri antagonism against the perceived Mormon threat reached the boiling point on the fateful day of July 20, 1833. In the morning, the appearance of a large company of men and women frightened the Mormon settlers working at the ferry on the Blue River. Rarely did such a large group gather to cross the river. According to a Mormon observer, quote unquote, "They had a solemn and determined look. I saw several women in their company who seemed to be more interested in mobbing than their husbands." They proceeded on to Independence, where a group of nearly 500 gathered from all over the county for the scheduled meeting at the courthouse. Sometime in the afternoon, a committee of 13 representing the large assemblage walked over to talk with the Mormon leaders. Representing the church were the leading high priests, including William W. Phelps. Isaac Morley, one of the high priests, reported, "They requested us to leave the county right away. We told them that we should want a little time to consider upon the matter. They told us that we could have only 15 minutes. We then replied to them that we couldn't comply or consent to their proposals within that time. One of them observed and said, 'The work of destruction will then commence immediately.'" In the course of the confrontation, the committee demanded that the Mormons should immediately stop the publication of Mormon teachings and close printing in Jackson County. The representatives returned a few yards to the courthouse to the large and restless group that was becoming mob-like in character. In a few minutes, passions erupted and all the men voted to raise the Phelps printing establishment. They believed destroying Phelps' Mormon press would be the first necessary step to thwarting the Mormon movement. Among the citizens at the courthouse was a man whose wife, Sally Phelps, had recently attended in childbirth. This individual slipped out of the meeting and alerted the Phelps family. Phelps, realizing that he would be a target of much of the hatred, quickly exited and found a hiding place. He took with him some copies of the galley sheets of the Book of Commandments. John Whitmer spirited the handwritten manuscript Book of Revelations to safety. Sally dressed the children and prepared to ride off with a wagon and a team of horses. The angry mob threatened her with death if she didn't leave. Inadvertently, she left 2 of her sons in the building. About 300 men dashed over to the print shop, the first target of their destruction. Some men who disagreed with this mob action went home, but there were plenty of hands to do the dirty work. Samuel Weston, a justice of the peace, grabbed a club to ward off Mormon defenders. John Whitmer reported that the mob threatened to kill the attending Mormons if they didn't leave immediately. While the mob was forming, many of the elders stood and looked on, predicting that the first man who touched the building would be paralyzed and fall dead upon the ground. The mob, however, paid no attention to their predictions and prayers for God to come and slay them, but with one accord sized hold off the implements necessary to destroy the house. Some men hurried up the flight of steps on the outside of the building and knocked open the door to the press room with a piece of timber. Majors reported that within the quickest time imaginable they had it torn to the ground and scattered their literature to the 4 winds. All Mormon witnesses likewise testified that the Phelps house and print shop was demolished, the furniture destroyed, the type scattered, and the press broken from being thrown from the upper window. The mob had every intention of wreaking more havoc with the Mormons and their possessions. After finishing with the print shop, they went north across the street to Sidney Gilbert's store. Their intent was to demolish it as well, but after Gilbert pleaded for clemency and promised to close it, they stopped. Vigilantes then went to the home of Bishop Edward Partridge, took him captive and feathered him. Alexander Majors reminded his readers many years later that, quote-unquote, many of the people who were among the angry mob were respectable citizens and law-abiding in every respect, but who actually thought they were doing God's service to destroy if possible and obliterate Mormonism. Watching the whole scene was a prominent Jackson County citizen named Lilburn, who was the sitting lieutenant governor of Missouri. He exclaimed with satisfaction, "Mormons are the common enemies of mankind and ought to be destroyed. And you know what our Jackson County boys can do? You must leave the country." The mob had become so frenzied that they seemed to lose all sense of respectability. They physically assaulted numerous church members within these approximately 2 hours of rampaging. The next several hours and days were absolutely frightening for the Phelps family and all the Independence Mormons. The 2 Phelps boys were not found until late that Saturday evening, when some church members walked into the demolished Phelps home and found them uninjured under brick and debris. At this stage, Phelps and the other leading high priests felt they had no choice but to submit to the terrorism of the mob, and they signed a pre-written treaty. This satisfied the vigilantes and they quickly dispersed. The treaty called for church leaders to move their families out of Jackson County by the 1st of next January, to influence half of the Mormon society to remove by the same date, and to ensure that all Mormons be gone from Jackson County by the next April 1st. The church leaders were to advise and try all means in their power to stop any more of their sect from moving to this county. Henry McCarty was better known as Billy the Kid, but also known as Henry Antrim and William Harrison Bonney. He was a 19th century American frontier outlaw and gunman who was a participant in the Lincoln County War. He was reputed to have killed 21 men, one for each year of his life. McCarty was 5 feet and 8 inches in height, had blue eyes, smooth cheeks, and prominent front teeth. He was said to be friendly and personable at times, but he could also be short-tempered and determined. This made him a very dangerous outlaw when combined with his shooting skills and cunning. He was also famous for apparently always wearing a sugarloaf sombrero hat with a wide green decorative band. He was little known in his own lifetime, but was catapulted into a legend in the year after his death, when his killer sheriff Patrick Garrett published a widely sensationalistic biography of the outlaw called The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid. Little is known about Henry McCarty's background, but he's thought to have been born on Ellen Street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan Island, New York, on September 17, 1859 to Catherine McCarty. He was baptized on September 28, 1859 in the Church of St. Peter. His younger brother Joseph McCarty was born in 1863. His parents were of Irish Catholic descent. Following the death of her husband, Catherine McCarty and her sons moved to Indianapolis, Indiana, where she met William Henry Harrison Antrim. Faced with an indigent husband, McCarty's mother took in boarders in order to provide for her sons. She was afflicted with tuberculosis, even though she was seen by her boarders and neighbors as, quote by quote, a jolly Irish lady full of life and mischief. The following year, on September 16, 1874, his mother died. She is buried in the Memory Lane Cemetery in Silver City. At age 14, McCarty was taken in by a neighboring family who operated a hotel where he worked to pay for his keep. The manager was impressed by the youth, boasting that he was the only kid who ever worked for him that didn't steal. His school teacher said that the young orphan was no more of a problem than any other boy, always quite willing to help with chores around the schoolhouse. On September 23, 1875, McCarty was arrested for hiding a bundle of stolen clothes for a man playing a prank on a Chinese laundryman. 2 days after McCarty was thrown in jail, the scrawny teen escaped by worming his way up to the jailhouse chimney. From that point on, McCarty was more or less a fugitive. He is known to have stolen horses. He eventually found work as an itinerant ranch hand and shepherd in southeastern Arizona. In 1877, he became a civilian teamster at Fort Grant Army Post in Arizona, with the duty of hauling logs from a timber camp to a sawmill. The civilian blacksmith at the camp, Frank P. Windy Cahill, took pleasure in bullying young McCarty. At August 17, Cahill attacked McCarty after a verbal exchange and threw him to the ground. McCarty retaliated by throwing his .45 pistol and shooting Cahill, who died the next day. Once again, McCarty was in custody, this time in the camp's guardhouse, awaiting the arrival of the local marshal. Before the marshal could arrive, however, McCarty escaped. Again on the run, McCarty, who had begun to refer to himself as William H. Bonney, next turned up in the house of High School Jones in Pecos Valley, New Mexico. Apaches had stolen McCarty's horse, which forced him to walk many miles to the nearest settlement, which was Mrs. Jonas's home. She nursed the young man, who was near death, back to health. The Jones family developed a strong attachment to McCarty and gave him one of their horses. In the autumn of 1877, Bonnie McCarty moved to Lincoln County, New Mexico, and was hired as a cattle guard by John Tunstall, an English cattle rancher, banker, and merchant, and his partner Alexander McSween, a prominent lawyer. A conflict known later as the Lincoln County Cattle War had begun between the established town merchants and the ranchers. Events turned bloody on 18 February 1878 when Tunstall, unarmed, was caught on an open range while herding cattle. Tunstall's murder enraged Bonnie and the other ranch hands. They formed their own group called the Regulators, led by ranch hand Richard Dick Brewer, and proceeded to hunt down two of the members of the posse that had killed Tunstall. They captured Bill Martin and Frank Baker on March 6 and killed them on March 9. This occurred near Agua Negra. While returning to Lincoln, they also killed one of their own members, a man named McCluskey, whom they suspected of being a traitor. On April 1, Regulators Jim French, Frank McNabb, John Middleton, Fred Waite, Henry Brown, and McCarty ambushed Sheriff William J. Brady and his deputy George Hitman, killing them both. McCarty was wounded while trying to retrieve a rifle belonging to him, taken from him by Sheriff Brady in an earlier arrest. On April 4, they tracked down and killed an old buffalo hunter known as Buckshot Roberts, whom they suspected of involvement in the Tunstall murder. But not before Roberts shot and killed Dick Brewer, who had been the Regulators' leader up until that point. Two other Regulators were wounded during the gun battle, which took place at Blazer's Mill. McCarty took over as leader of the Regulators following Brewer's death. Under indictment for the Brady killing, McCarty and his gang spent the next several months in hiding, and were trapped along with McSween in McSween's home in Lincoln on July 15, 1878 by some of Brady's men. After a 5-day siege, McSween's house was set on fire. McCarty and the other Regulators fled, and Henry McCarty killed one of Brady's men in the process, and maybe more. McSween was shot down while fleeing the blaze, and his death essentially marked the end of the Lincoln County Cattle War. In the autumn of 1878, former Union Army General Lew Wallace became the new territorial governor of New Mexico. Wallace proclaimed an amnesty for any man involved in the Lincoln County War who was not already under indictment. McCarty, who had fled to Texas after escaping from McSween's house, was under indictment, but Wallace was intrigued by rumors that the young man was willing to surrender himself and testify against other combatants if amnesty could be extended to him. In March 1879, Wallace and McCarty met in Lincoln County at the home of Justice of the Peace Square Willison to discuss the possibility of a deal. True to form, McCarty greeted the governor with a revolver in one hand and a Winchester rifle in the other. After taking several days to consider Wallace's offer, McCarty agreed to testify in return for amnesty. The arrangement called for McCarty to submit to a token arrest and a short stay in jail until the conclusion of his courtroom testimony. Although McCarty's testimony helped to indict John Dolan, the district attorney disregarded Wallace's order to set McCarty free after testifying. Instead, Billy was returned to jail in June 1879. McCarty eventually slipped out of his handcuffs and fled with his friend Doc Scurlock. For the next year and a half, McCarty survived by rustling, gambling, and killing. In January 1880, during a well-documented altercation, he killed a man named Joe Grant in a Fort Sumner saloon. Grant was boasting that he would kill the kid if he saw him, not realizing the man he was playing poker with was Billy the Kid. In those days, people only loaded their revolvers with 5 bullets since there were no safeties and a lot of accidents. The Grant was asked by Billy the Kid if he could see his ivory-handled revolver, and while looking at the weapon, cycled the cylinder so the hammer would fall on the empty chamber. McCarty then let Grant know who he was. When Grant fired, nothing happened, and McCarty then shot him 3 times. When asked about the incident later, Billy remarked, "It was a game for 2 and I got there first." In November 1880, a posse member named James Carlisle ventured into the house under white flag in an attempt to negotiate the group's surrender, with Greathouse being sent out as a hostage for the posse. At some point in the night, it became apparent to Carlisle that the outlaws were stalling, when suddenly a shot was accidentally fired from outside. Carlisle, assuming the posse members had shot Greathouse, decided to run for his life, crashing through a window into the snow outside. As he did so, the posse, mistaking Carlisle for one of the gang, fired and killed him. Realizing what they had done and now demoralized, the posse scattered, allowing McCarty and his gang to slip away. McCarty later wrote to Governor Wallace claiming innocence in the killing of Carlisle and of involvement in cattle rustling in general. During this time, the kid also developed a friendship with an ambitious local bartender and former buffalo hunter named Pat Garrett. Running on a pledge to rid the area of rustlers, Garrett was elected as sheriff of Lincoln County in November 1880, and in early December he put together a posse and set out to arrest McCarty, now known almost exclusively as Billy the Kid, and carrying a $500 bounty on his head from Governor Wallace. The posse led by Garrett fared much better and his men closed in quickly. On December 19, McCarty barely escaped the posse's midnight ambush in Fort Sumner, during which one of McCarty's gang, Tom O'Folliard, was shot and killed. On December 23, he was tracked to an abandoned stone building located in a remote location called Stinking Springs. While McCarty and his gang were asleep inside, Garrett's posse surrounded the building and waited for sunrise. The next morning, a cattle rustler and a good friend of McCarty named Charlie Botter stepped outside to feed his horse. Mistaken for McCarty, he was killed by the posse. Soon afterwards, somebody from within the building reached for the horse halter's rope, but Garrett shot and killed the horse. The horse's body then blocked the only exit. As the lawman began to cook breakfast over an open fire, Garrett and McCarty engaged in a friendly exchange, with Garrett inviting McCarty outside to eat and McCarty inviting Garrett to go to hell. Realizing that they had no hope of escape, the besieged and hungry outlaws finally surrendered later that day and were allowed to join in the meal. On April 13, he was sentenced by Judge Warren Bristol, a longtime foe of McCarty, to hang. The execution was scheduled for May 13 and he was sent to Lincoln to await this date. Held under guard by two of Garrett's deputies, James Bell and Robert Ollinger, on the top floor of the town's courthouse. The details of the escape were as follows. Bell staggered out into the street and collapsed, mortally wounded. Meanwhile, McCarty scooped up Ollinger's 10-gauge double-barrel shotgun and waited at the upstairs window for Ollinger, who had been across the street with some other prisoners, to come to Bell's aid. As Ollinger came running into view, McCarty leveled the shotgun at him and called out, "Hello, Bob," and shot him dead. Responding to rumors that McCarty was still lurking in the vicinity of Fort Sumner almost 3 months after his escape, Sheriff Garrett and two deputies, John Pugh and John McKinney, set out on July 14, 1881 to question one of the town's residents, a friend of McCarty named Pedro Maxwell. Near midnight, as Garrett and Maxwell sat talking in Maxwell's darkened bedroom, McCarty unexpectedly entered the room. He couldn't recognize Garrett in the poor light. McCarty drew his pistol and backed away, asking in Spanish, "Quién es?" Which means, "Who is it? Who is it?" Recognizing McCarty's voice, Garrett drew his own pistol and fired twice, the first bullet hitting McCarty just above his heart and killing him instantly. Henry McCarty, alias Billy the Kid, was buried the next day in Fort Sumner's old military cemetery, between his fallen companions Tom O'Folliard and Charlie Boder. A single tombstone was later erected over the graves, giving the three outlaws names, and with the word Powell's also carved into it. The tombstone had been stolen and recovered 3 times since being placed in the 1940s, and the entire gravesite is now enclosed by a steel cage. Hannah Duston was the first American woman to have a statue built in her honor in 1874. Today, what she did to deserve it might be called by some a monument to an atrocity. Hannah scalped the 10 Indians who had attacked her farm, dragged her from her bed, and burned her house down before taking her captive and killing her 6-day-old infant. It is difficult to imagine today scalping a person. There is adhesive tissue under the dermis of the skull which must be cut and pulled off by the hair. The scalp bleeds exceedingly freely, and the instrument of destruction, especially if crude, like a hand-forged iron knife, would be wet, clumsy, and slippery. And what of the revulsion one might feel at handling a dead human in this way? Had Hannah's life prepared her for that? She must have been extremely angry when she scalped the Abenaki Indians who had recently been her captors. They had after all attacked her farm, dragged her from her bed, and burned her house. They had taken her captive and almost immediately killed her week-old infant by bashing the infant's head against a tree because the baby was crying. Having taken her captive, the Abenaki Indians forced Hannah and her aunt Mary to walk many miles north in marsh while wearing only their night clothes, and for all she knew, the rest of her family was dead. Hannah and her family were no strangers to horror. She had been captured at the end of King William's War, in an era distinguished from its savagery on both sides in many outlying British settlements. This was still colonial Massachusetts Bay. It was the 15th of March in the year 1697. There was still snow on the ground, though it had melted away in sunny spots from the bases of bushes and trees. To the northwest of the main town of Haverhill, in the colony of Massachusetts Bay, there were 6 or so buildings surrounded by fields and meadows. This was where Hannah Duston lived in a small brick house, with her husband Thomas, a brickmaker and farmer, and their 8 children. Hannah was 40 years of age at the time and had just giving birth 6 days before to her 8th child, a girl called Martha. Her capture occurred during the raid on Haverhill by the Abenaki people from Quebec during King William's War, in which 27 colonists were killed. On the day of the raid, Hannah was lying in bed. She was talking with her aunt and also the local midwife, Mary Neff. Hannah had born a girl child just 6 days before. She was wearing her night clothes and the baby was nursing well. She was a strong infant according to Hannah later. The other children were outside playing. They range in age from 3 to 18. There was not much work to do in the month of March other than splitting wood. The fields were not ready to be plowed and the stock had been cared for in the barn. Thomas Dustin was out in the fields at the time of the raid. Likely he was wearing and had his gun with him, the long rifle. The previous summer in Haverhill, 4 of his neighbors were killed by Indians while in their fields picking up beans. It is believed, according to documents about the raid, that Thomas caught a movement out of the corner of his eye. He saw 10 Abenaki Indians stepping from behind the trees in the distance. A series of shots then broke the morning stillness, and Thomas leaped on his horse and galloped towards the house, screaming as he rode,
"Indians, run to the marsh garrison, now!"
The children dropped what they were holding and grabbed the younger ones. The walled garrison was nearly a mile away and the Indians are already close. The chances of reaching the garrison were small. Hannah related later that Thomas rushed into the house while she was getting out of bed. Aunt Mary grabbed Martha the infant and ran outside. Hannah told her husband to run and escape with the other children. There was no time for any goodbyes as the Indians had just captured Mary Neff and the infant and were apparently distracted while Thomas escaped. The other children had run some 600 feet with the older ones carrying the younger children. Thomas rode up among them. His plan was to snatch up 1 or 2 of the younger children and ride away with them to save a few. The Indians were in pursuit and Thomas stopped his horse, dismounted, and using the horse as a shield threatened the small group of pursuers with his rifle. The Indians took cover and fired, but neither Thomas nor his horse was hit. Thomas jumped back on the horse and rode up to his children. The Indians had reloaded their guns and renewed the pursuit. Once more, Thomas dismounted and menaced his pursuers. Again the Indians fired and again, but neither Thomas nor his horse was hit. The Indians apparently gave up. There were easier spoils back at the group of undefended houses where the attack began. The Indians didn't kill Hannah and Mary. Hannah related that 27 of her friends and neighbors were killed and 13 taken hostage. The captives were collected into a group with some 20 Indians. The victors carried things taken from the now burning house, including a large piece of cloth torn from Hannah's loom. Hannah was huddled beside Mary. In the ensuing confusion when she was captured, Mary had lost a shoe. With the hostages, Indians turned to the north away from the garrison to get away with what they had. According to Hannah's later statements, Aunt Mary was carrying baby Martha when she stumbled. The infant began crying and suddenly one of the Indians grabbed Martha from Mary and swinging the infant by her feet, smashed her head against a tree and killing her. Hannah and Mary were then pushed ahead. Hannah stated later that she believed that the Indians were annoyed by the crying. Hannah and the others traveled about 12 miles that first day through swamps and some snow, up hills and over brooks. The Indians placed the household goods they had confiscated on the backs of the captives, making travel difficult. Hannah said that several of the prisoners were not able to keep up the grueling pace and were taken aside and tomahawked. Their scalps were added to the collection already carried on poles or packs. The first night when the party stopped to rest, Hannah and Mary held each other for warmth and comfort. Hannah said they slept that night with a piece of rawhide pressed over their torsos and tucked under them. For 15 days they traveled north. Finally, near present-day Boscawen, New Hampshire, north of present-day Concord, the Indians conducted the party to an island in the Merrimack River at the junction of the Kentucky River to rest for a few days. It was easier to keep watch from the island for any pursuing militia and other Indian raiding parties. Hannah related later that the Indians they were with prayed 3 times a day in Latin, having been converted by the French to Catholicism. Hannah's immediate captor told her in broken English that he had lived for some years with a preacher named Rowlandson he had captured and been taught to pray in English. He did not allow Mary and Hannah to pray openly. They had to do it in secret while gathering wood or water. Years later, Hannah said in her belated confession of faith, "I'm thankful for my captivity. It was the comfortablest time that I ever had, for in my affliction God made His word comfortable to me." After another 2 weeks, the Indians split up. Hannah and Mary were parceled out to a group whose eventual destination Hannah was able to determine was a place called St. Francis in Canada. This smaller group consisted of 2 warriors, 3 adult women, and 7 children. Also among them was a 14-year-old English boy named Samuel Leonardson taken from Worcester in the western part of Massachusetts Bay some 18 months before. He had been with the Indians so long he had learned to speak their language and so was considered almost a member of the tribe. Despite not trying to escape in all that time by one account, Samuel was moved by the plight of these new captives, and a longing for home had been stirred in him by the presence of the two women. From what he overheard, Samuel related to Hannah and Mary that when they reached St. Francis, they would be stripped of their clothes and forced to run the gauntlet, as apparently was the custom with new captives. Before the band of Indians and captives set out on the next leg of their journey, it was apparently here that Hannah saw her only chance to escape. She observed that while on the island, that her captors had let down their guard and had grown careless. In Hannah's words later, she reasoned that the Indians believed that the two women were too weak to attempt an escape, especially on an island with the river in flood. Guards were no longer posted at night. Hannah determined that with Samuel and Mary, she might overwhelm the small band of Indians, particularly if they were added the element of surprise. She related later that she persuaded Samuel to ask Bampico, the only Indian of the party whose name is known, how he killed the English quickly. Bampico pointed to the temple of his head and stated how to strike quickly and kill the victim. Hannah's plan was simple, she related later. At night when the Indians were asleep, she and Mary and Samuel, having hidden some hatches earlier, would position themselves at the heads of two of the Indians. At the signal from Hannah, they would begin the attack. Only one Indian was to be spared, a young boy. Hannah decided to take him back to Haverhill with her, if she could make it back to her home. It was very late on the night of 30 March 1697. With only the light from two fires and the moon, Hannah, Mary, and Samuel stood ready to strike. The sound of the rushing river made for a good cover, and then, at Hannah's signal, the three captives struck their opponents by sharply bringing the blades down into the temples on the sides of their heads. Suddenly, Hannah related later, all was confusion. It was Hannah who raised her hatchet again and again. When she was done and all of the Indians were still, Hannah paused out of breath and covered in blood. Hannah later said that Samuel had killed just one. Mary agreed to kill one of the three Indian women. She was a badly wounded squaw who had managed to survive and escape, and she took the Indian boy Hannah had intended to take back to Haverhill. Hannah did not scalp the dead right away. She said later that she was terrified that her plan will fail. The wounded squaw was making her way to the other Indian band only a bit farther upriver. A white captive with the other band later reported that he saw the squaw stagger in, bleeding from 7 wounds of the head and face, and told the ghastly story of Hannah's attack. Hannah gathered up what food was at hand and told Mary and Samuel to dress in Indian clothes. She took her bloody hatchet and her dad capture's flintlock rifle and carried all this to the bank of the Merrimack River, where she packed one of the Indian canoes and scuttled the others. Hannah related that they were moving away from the island when she suddenly stopped rowing, turned the canoe around, and returned to the island, leaving Samuel and Mary at the edge of the river in the canoe. Thinking about what the Indians did to her 6-day-old infant daughter Martha, Hannah went back to the scene of the bloodbath, took a knife she found among the belongings of the camp, and scalped all 10 of the Indians, including 6 children. Then she found the large piece of cloth that had been taken from her loom in Haverhill and wrapped the 10 scalps into the cloth. In the river, she washed her hands, the hatchet and the knife, and got back into the canoe for the journey south. They traveled only at night to avoid detection and capture. With Mary and Samuel, Hannah reached Haverhill several days later. Her husband and children were overjoyed to find her and Mary alive. Hannah related the story of Martha's death and of her journey with the Abenakis, and she displayed the contents of the bloody cloth. A few weeks later, Hannah, Mary, Samuel, and Thomas traveled to Boston, where they petitioned the General Court for money for the scalps. The colony of Massachusetts Bay had posted a bounty of £50 per scalp in September 1694, which was reduced to £25 in June 1695, and then entirely repealed in December 1696. Wives had no legal status in those days, so Thomas petitioned the legislature on behalf of Hannah Duston, requesting that the bounties for the scalps to be paid, even though the law providing for them had been repealed. On the 16th of June 1697, the Massachusetts Bay General Court voted to give them a reward for killing their captors. Hannah Duston received £25, and Mary Neff and Samuel Leonardson split another £25. The General Court stated, quote by quote,
Vote for allowing £50 to Thomas Dustin in behalf of his wife Hannah, and to Mary Neff and Samuel Leonardson, captives escaped from the Indians for their service in slaying their captors. Voted in concurrence with the representatives that there be allowed and ordered out of the public treasury unto Thomas Dustin of Haverhill, on behalf of Hannah his wife, the sum of £25, to Mary Neff the sum of £12 10 shillings, and to Samuel Leonardson the sum of £12 10 shillings as a reward for their service.
Henry Plummer might be called a good instance of the gentleman desperado if such a thing is possible. A man of at least a certain amount of refinement, and certainly one who under different surroundings might have led a different life. For the sake of contrast, if for nothing else, we may take the case of Boone Helm, one of Plummer's gang who was the opposite of Plummer in every way except the readiness to rob and kill. Boone Helm was bad, and nothing could have made him anything but bad. He was by birth and breeding low, coarse, cruel, animal-like, and utterly depraved, and for him no name but ruffian could fitly apply. Helm was born in Kentucky, but his family moved to Missouri during his early youth, so the boy was brought up on the borderland between civilization and the savage frontier. For this was about the time of the closing days of the old Santa Fe Trail, and the towns of Independence and Westport were still sending out their wagon trains to the far mountain regions. By the time Boone Helm was grown, and soon after his marriage, the great gold craze of California broke out and he joined the rush westward. Already he was a murderer, and already he had a reputation as a quarrelsome and dangerous man. He was of powerful build and turbulent temper, delighting in nothing so much as feats of strength, skill, and hardihood. His community was glad to be rid of him, as was any community he ever lived in. In the California diggings, Helm continued to line of life mapped out for him from birth. He met men of his own kidney and was ever ready for a duel with weapons. In this way he killed several men. No one knows how many, but this sort of thing was so common in the case of so many men in those days that little attention was paid to it. It must have been a ruthless murder which at length caused him to flee the coast to escape the vengeance of the miners. He headed north and east after a fashion of the times following the California boom, and was bound for the mountain placers in 1853 when he's recorded as appearing at the Dallas, Oregon. He and a half dozen companions whom he had picked up on the way, and most of whom were strangers to each other, now started for Fort Hall, Idaho, intending to go from there to a point below Salt Lake City. The party was now reduced to one of those awful starving marches of the wilderness which are now and then chronicled in Western life. This meant that the weak must perish where they fell. The strength of Helm and one of the other men, whose name is Burton, enabled them to push on ahead, leaving their companions behind in the mountains. Almost within reach of Fort Hall, Burton gave out and was left behind in an abundant cabin. Helm pushed on into the old stockade, but found it also abundant for the winter season. He then went back to where he left Burton, and according to his own report, he was trying to get wood for a fire when he suddenly heard a pistol shot and returned to find that Burton had killed himself. He stayed on this spot and like a hyena preyed upon the dead body of his companion. He ate one leg of the body and then, wrapping up the other in a piece of an old shirt, threw it across his shoulder and started on further east. He had before this on the march declared to the party that he had practiced cannibalism at an earlier time and proposed to do so again if it became necessary on this trip across the mountains. His calm threat was now verified. Helm was found at last at an Indian camp by John W. Powell, who learned that he was as hard a character as he had ever run across. Nonetheless, he took care of Helm, gave him food and clothes, and took him to the settlements around Salt Lake. Powell found that Helm had a bag containing over $1,400 in coins, which he had carried across the divide through all his hardships. He would take no money from Helm, and the latter never even thanked him for his kindness, but left him as soon as he reached the Mormon settlements. In the Mormon settlements, the abundant ruffian boasted of what he had done and settled down briefly to the customary enjoyments of the rough one in town. Here he spent his money, hired out as a Danite, killed a couple of men whom the Mormons wanted removed, and soon got so bad that he had to leave. Once more, he headed west to California, and once more he started back north from San Francisco for reasons satisfactory to himself. While in California, as was later learned, he undertook to rob and kill a man at an outlying ranch who had taken him in and befriended him when he was in need and fleeing from vengeance. He showed no understanding of the feeling of gratitude, no matter what was done for him. In Oregon, Helm went back to robbery as his customary means of support, and he killed several men at this time of his life. How many will never be known. In 1862, as the mountain places were now beginning to draw the crowds of mining men, it was natural that Boone Helm should show up at Florence. Here he killed a man in cold blood and in treachery, while his enemy was not armed after their quarrel had been compromised. This victim was Dutch Fred, a man with a reputation as a fighter, but he had never offended Helm, who killed him at the instigation of an enemy of his victim and possibly for hire. He shot Fred while the latter stood looking him in the face, unarmed, and missing him with the first shot, took deliberate aim with the second and murdered his man in cold blood. This was pretty bad even for Florence, and he had to leave. That fall, he turned up far to the north, on the Fraser River in British Columbia. Here he was once more reduced to the danger of a starving food marsh in the wilderness, and here once more he was guilty of eating the body of his companion whom he is supposed to have slain. The British authorities sent him back, and for a time was held in Portland, Oregon for safekeeping. Later he was tried in Florence for killing Dutch Fred, but the witness had disappeared and people had long ago lost interest in the crime because of others more recent. Helm escaped justice and was supposed to have gone to Texas, but he soon appeared in several settlements and moved from one to the other. Later on, he killed many more men. The courage and hardihood of Boone Helm were in evidence to the close of his life. 3 men of the vigilantes did the dangerous work of arresting him and took him by closing in on him as he stood in the street talking. "If I'd had a chance," said he, "or if I had guessed what you all were up to, you'd never have taken me." He claimed not to know what was wanted of him when brought before the judges of the vigilante court, and solemnly declared that he had never killed a man in all his life. They made him kiss the Bible and swore to this over again, just to see to what length his perjured and depraved soul would go. He swore on the Bible with perfect calmness. This did not move his captors, and indeed, Helm was little expectant that they would be. He called aside one of them whom he knew, declined a clergyman, and confessed to murder in Missouri and in California. He admitted that he had been imprisoned once or twice, but denied that he had been a road agent. He accused some of his warmest friends of the latter crime. Jack Gallagher, also under arrest, heard him thus indiscriminate himself and others of the gang and called him all the names in the calendar, telling him he ought to die. "I've looked at death in all forms," said Helm coolly, "and I'm not afraid to die." He then asked for a glass of whiskey, as did many of these murderers when they were brought to the gallows. From then on, he was cool and unconcerned, and showed a finish worthy of one ambitious to be thought wholly bad. There were 6,000 men assembled in Virginia City to see the executions of these criminals, who were fast being rounded up and hung by the citizens. The place of execution was in a half-finished log building. The ropes were passed over the ridgepole, and as the front of the building was open, a full view was offered of the murderers as they stood on the boxes arranged for the drops. Boone Helm looked around at his friends and told Jack to stop making such a fuss. "There is no use being afraid to die," he said. And indeed, there probably never lived a man more actually devoid of all sense of fear. He valued neither the life of others nor his own. He saw that the end had come and was careless about the rest. He had a sore finger which was tied up, and this seemed to trouble him more than anything else. There was some delay about the confessions and the last offices of those who prayed for the condemned, and this seemed as an irritation for Boone Helm. "For God's sake," he said, "if you're going to hang me, I want you to do it right now. If not, I want you to tie up my finger for me. Give me that overcoat of yours, Jack," he said to Jack Gallagher as the latter was stripped for the news. "You won't need it now," replied Jack Gallagher, who was dying blasphemous. About then, George Lane, one of the line of men about to be hung, jumped off his box on his own account. "There is one gone to hell," remarked Boonhelm philosophically. Jack Gallagher was hanged next, and as he struggled, his former friend watched him calmly. "Kick away, old fellow," said Boonhelm. Then, when his turn came, he commented, "My turn next. I'll be in hell with you in a minute." Boonhelm was a Confederate and a bitter one, and this seems to have remained with him to the last. "Every man for his principles," he shouted. "Hurrah for Jeff Davis! Let her rip!" He sprang off the box, and so he finished, utterly hard and reckless to the last. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to be notified about our latest videos.